Spring and Hallow Falls came early that year, but kindly. The snow had receded in streaks across the plains, revealing mud-thick trails and brittle grass flattened by months of ice. The sun lingered longer each day, but the cold still clung to the bones like memory. The caravan bound for the Pacific had made poor time even before the rains. When they reached the swollen river and found the bridge broken, everything began to unravel. The mud stole their wheels. The water took their food, tempers flared faster than fires, and the blame came swiftly. Whispers turned into accusations, glances sharpened into decisions. There was no formal council, no vote, just a shared bitterness, a group looking to shed weight. They chose three. Joanne Reeves, once a seamstress with careful fingers, now held nothing but a bundle of cloth and the ache of something long gone. So will the wheels. The water took their food, tempers flared faster than fires, and the blame came swiftly. Whispers turned into accusations. Glance of the durations that also we had sound rate off. There's dad, there's a group looking to shed weight. They chose promises of ass, and the blame came swiftly. Whispers turned into accusations. Choir then berries, produced them, caninical wires, and then bloil ways. The water took their food. Tempers flared faster than fires, and the blame came swiftly. Whispers turned into accusations. Glances sharpened into decisions. There was no formal council, no vote that year, but not kindly. The snow had receded in streaks across the plains, revealing mud-thick trails and province, familiar areas, and biolumbous people the cold days of plains. And
Bess Taylor, barely 20, said little and watched too much. Her eyes were shadowed, her shoulders narrow. She had limped since the third day on the trail, and though she made no complaint, others did for her. Hannah Lawson, older than the rest, with hands bound in worn linen from frostbite, survived in another winter. She had been a nurse in her youth, a midwife since, and still carried the sharpness of command in her voice when she spoke, perhaps too often for the men around her. They were roused before dawn. No warning, no ceremony. Their belongings, what little they had, were dumped unceremoniously on the ground. A few threadbare blankets, a pot with a cracked bottom, no food, no weapons, no farewells. The leader of the group, a man with a red beard and a voice like a whip, perhaps too often for the men around her. They were roused before dawn. No warning, no ceremony. Their belongings, what little they had, of what of a present. To pay and a voice, Lako's mother's. Freddie, the coprobums a voice, Ole, airy, a voice. Sepulabires, Frisiative, Indies, of the way, Indials, the cussles. Soetation, Beas Tailors and 30 fair, Indies, of fairy tales and voice, like a whip, and very bales of the blood dairies, bees, their mothers. The leader of the group, a man with a red beard and a voice like a whip, perhaps too often for the men around her. They were roused before dawn, fellows in the next prison. Wheels churned into motion, hooves beat the ground in a steady rhythm, and one by one, the wagons disappeared into the gray mist of morning. Left behind, the three women stood silent. The landscape around them offered no comfort. Marshland stretched in every direction, interrupted only by gnarled trees with roots too exposed, too waterlogged. Patches of dry grass poked through the muck like brittle warnings. The sky above was a uniform slate, heavy with unspent rain. Wind pushed through the reeds in low murmurs. Joanne was the first to move. She gathered the blankets with steady hands, folding them even as her lips trembled. Hannah took stock of what remained, her brow tight with calculation. Bess stood motionless, her eyes tracking the point where the last wagon had vanished, as if trying to burn it into memory before it faded completely. They didn't speak for a long time. To do wagon, to addition, home, to his pressed, to four more hunnel.
perhaps that was what made it bearable. Eventually, they turned their backs to the road that no longer belonged to them and faced the wild that did. They had no food, no shelter, no map. But they had each other. Strangers yesterday. Something more now. They moved with care, skirting the worst of the bogs, stepping around frozen puddles where frogs had yet to return. Their breath ghosted in the air. Each footstep was a vow, not to endure, but to claim. They were not passengers anymore. They were something else. They walked until their legs burned and the sky dimmed, trailing across the marshland in uneven silence. The wet ground sucked at their boots, and the grasses whispered like unseen mouths. By the time the sun fell behind the hills, the light was nearly gone, and the wind had begun to howl low and mean through the reeds. It was Bess who spotted the building first. A shape crouched in the distance, blackened and slumped against the land. They approached slowly, wary of what ruin might still hide. What remained was the skeleton of a logging station, half burned and rotting at the edges. The walls were scorched, the roof partially collapsed, but enough still stood to hold off the wind. The door hung loose on a broken hinge. Windows gaped like empty eyes, their glass shattered long ago. Inside, the air smelled of old smoke and mildew. Rusted saw blades hung crooked on the walls. Splinters littered the floor like bones. A broken cot rested in the corner, collapsed inner them before some pro-chromis explained sails, a wind and menestases, pimbers, a kind of flack and rose in the pearl corner between the crafts to the corner. A favorite cry by sewing made them when what would be a reel's bod, and the wind had begun to howl low and mean through the reeds. It was Bess who spotted the building first. A shape crouched in the distance, blackened and slumped against the land. They walked until their legs burned and the sky dimmed, trailing across the marshland in uneven silence. The wet ground sucked at their boots, and the grasses whispered like unseen mouths. By the time the sun fell behind the hills, the light was nearly gone, and the wind had begun to howl low and mean through the reeds. It was Bess who spotted the building first. A shape crouched in the distance, blackened and slumped against the land.
It wasn't safe, but it was shelter. They settled in without speaking. Joanne found a bundle of mildewed fabric buried beneath a pile of warped boards. She tore it into strips with methodical hands, stitching with a needle she kept sewn into the lining of her coat. The blankets she fashioned were rough and stiff, but warmer than nothing. Bess didn't move from the far wall, her eyes fixed on the doorway. Every sound made her flinch. Hannah scoured the back room and returned with a lump of hardened resin and a bundle of dry pine shavings, which she coaxed into a reluctant flame. The fire crackled low and sullen, more smoke than heat, but it gave them light. They sat close, arms brushing, legs tucked in tight. Outside, the wind moaned and scratched at the walls. In names, then, textics, be decised dello. Together, and, tights. They only noticed him when the door shifted open on a sudden gust of wind. A man stood there, tall, wrapped in a long oilskin coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weather-dark hat. He stepped forward, slow and measured, as though testing the ground. They tensed, but he made no threat. He set a bundle of firewood just inside the door, then pulled a small cloth sack from beneath his coat and placed it on the floor beside it. He didn't linger. He offered no name, no gesture, no voice. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark as soundlessly as he had come. The fire crackled. Bess's eyes remained fixed on the door long after it swung closed again. He reached for the sack and opened it with steady fingers.
The light was thin, pale, the kind that reveals more shadow than shape. She walked to the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground with practiced eyes. Tracks, wide boots, deep treads, heavy gait. They led toward the tree line and vanished among the moss. She didn't speak of them aloud, but she saw something in the way the tracks circled once, stopping just before the entrance, as if he'd stood there a while, watching. Not a threat, not yet, but watching. Each day blurred into the next, the rhythm of survival taking root deeper than memory. The marsh no longer felt like something to be crossed. It had become a cage, a breathing, watching thing that exhaled mist each morning inside darkness into their shelter at night. The women learned to read its moods the way one reads the sky before a storm. Breathing became a choice. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and the scent of decay. Warnings came with low-hanging fog that clung to their skin, turning every sound distant and strange. The trees moaned when the wind passed through them, and more than once, even Bess, who rarely spoke, stayed alert. Her eyes saw everything now, every twitch of shadow, every rustle that didn't belong. Then, one morning, he returned. A hunter stepped into the clearing just after dawn, a limp rabbit slung over his shoulder, a small barrel of water resting at his feet. He said nothing, simply knelt, skinned the animal with smooth, practiced motions, and tossed the pelt aside. The knife he used glinted only briefly in the weak sunlight before vanishing back into his coat. Hannah began calling him Garrett. It wasn't a name he confirmed, but he didn't reject it either. His silences were thick with implication. Alice, there was something measured in the way he moved. Deliberate, careful, as if aware of how easily trust could snap under the weight of wrong intention. He came and went without explanation. Some days he brought food. Samuel every scene for Francine was terrorized already.
He would point to a tree, a track, a change in the wind, and then leave them to puzzle out the meaning. He didn't speak in full thoughts, just fragments, dropped like stones into still water. Joanne watched him closely. She saw the way he checked the tree line before resting, the way he kept his back never fully exposed. He lived with secrets, old ones. Not the kind carved in trauma, but those earned in silence. She tried to read him, but he was all locked doors and shadows. Bess, on the other hand, began to drift toward him like dusk toward night. One evening, while Hannah and Joanne cleaned fish near the edge of the river, Bess crossed the clearing. She stood beside him on the log, knees pulled to her chest. They remained like that until the stars came out. He would point to a tree, a track, a change in the wind, and then leave them to puzzle out the meaning. He didn't speak in full thoughts, just fragments, dropped like stones into still water. Joanne watched him closely. She saw the way he checked the tree line before resting, the way he kept his back never fully exposed. He lived with secrets, old ones, not the kind carved in trauma, but those earned in silence. She tried to read him, but he was all locked doors and shadows. Bess, on the other hand, began toward him like dusk toward night. One evening, while Hannah and Joanne cleaned fish near the edge of the river, Bess crossed the clearing. She stood beside him, on the log, knees pulled to her chest. They remained like that until the stars came out. She tried to read him,
Not in the way a man teaches out of pride or power, but through action. He showed them how to set snares using reeds and wire, how to follow animal trails that wound around blind corners. He demonstrated how moss pointed to water, how certain bird song warned of nearby predators. He laid out constellations with a stick in the dirt and told them which ones moved fastest across the sky. The marsh began to feel less hostile, not safe but familiar. The trees no longer groaned with menace. They whispered as if accepting the presence of something new among them. The air changed too, lighter in places, the weight of the damp no longer quite so suffocating. Joanne caught herself humming once while kindling. Hannah began to speak of tinctures again, naming plants by touch. Bess laughed, brief and sharp, at the sound of Garrett cursing when a fish slipped from his hands.
The forest, ancient and watchful, was learning to make space for them, and in turn, they learned to move like it did, quiet, enduring, and hard to kill. Garrett returned late in the afternoon, his coat damp with river mist and his expression darker than the sky above them. He dropped his satchel at the edge of the fire and sat without a word. The others waited, sensing the weight he carried. When he finally spoke, it was with quiet certainty. He had found them. The men who had cast them out left them to die, still alive, still settled in comfort. Their camp lay 2 days to the southeast, nestled near the edge of an old quarry canyon, a forgotten mining site where stone had once been ripped from the earth and left to rot. Now it served as a staging ground for a small caravan of wagons and armed men. Among them was Wells Harper. Joanne hadn't spoken his name in weeks, but she had never let go of his face. The memory of his voice, dismissive and sharp, echoed like a wound that wouldn't close. Harper had been the one to speak the words, but they all carried guilt. 10 men, Garrett said, maybe more, armed, there at thorough appointment of varies every way, and they belay them on many mighty scores, but they all objected revenue tied by cheese to war though, many too, of various eating after, horses, shelter, and they were planning to move again, soon, but not yet. There was a window, a moment to act, a choice. That night, sleep did not come. Joanne lay awake beneath the blanket she had stitched together with the same thread she once used for wedding veils. Her fingers traced invisible patterns across the fabric as her mind ran through every possibility. Attack? Flee? Wait, she thought of Bess and Hannah, of the fire in their eyes now where once there had only been fatigue. She thought of the weight of being forgotten and how easily it could become permanent. Bess sat across the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes reflecting the flame. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. She didn't want to die. None of them did, but she wanted them, no men, to know, to see, to understand that what they had started hadn't withered, it had grown teeth. By morning, a decision had settled in their bones like ash after a long burn.
Garrett spread a weathered map across the ground, the parchment curled at the edges. He pointed to a ridgeline that cut through the hills, a shortcut, dangerous, narrow, but faster. It would bring them close without alerting the camp. They agreed to move separately and meet at a stream just below the southern slope by sunrise the next day. Preparations began quietly. Joanne returned ruins of the sawmill and bone-handled knife she had hidden beneath the floorboards. She cleaned it, sharpened it until it whispered against the whetstone. She cut strips of leather from an old saddlebag, stitching a sheath to wear tight across her chest. Hannah gathered herbs, soothing ones, clotting ones. She wrapped cloth into tight bundles and tucked them into the folds of her coat. She murmured to herself as she worked, not prayers exactly, but names, memories, promises. Bess cleaned the pistol Garrett had days ago, her hands steady now. No. Warriors of the West and science.
She adjusted the grip with scraps of cloth for comfort and strapped it low on her hip. Later, she would take a piece of charcoal and draw a mark on each bullet. Garrett remained apart from them, packing his gear with silent precision. His eyes flicked often toward the trees, scanning for movement. He checked his traps one last time, then knelt near the stream to refill his flask. He didn't speak, but his movements said enough. He had done this before. He knew what came next. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the clearing, the fire crackled low between them. They did not say goodbye. There was no need. What lay ahead could not be softened with words. Each one knew where to go, what to carry, who they were. They were not soldiers, not hunters, not assassins. They were something else now, and someone was going to remember them. They moved under the cloak of darkness, the path narrow and slick with moss, hugging the rim of a canyon that breathed cold up from its depths. Each step was a test of silence, of balance, of will. The night pressed close around them, soundless except for the occasional crack of frost or rustle of wind through bare branches. Breath came in plumes, white and steady, vanishing into the black. Their shadows stretched long behind them, swallowed by the terrain. Garrett led without looking back. His silhouette was a compass against the starlight, unwavering, certain. Joanne followed close, the weight of the hatchet firm against her side. Bess and Hannah brought up the rear, their footfalls quiet as memory. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Only the plan, only the target. By morning, pale gold light crept over the ridgeline. They halted at the crest of a small rise and looked down. The camp lay nestled in the canyon floor, protected on three sides by rock. Wagons circled the clearing. A canvas tent stood near the fire pit. Smoke drifted from a blackened chimney stack. Men moved slowly between tasks, feeding horses, boiling coffee, hammering at wagon wheels. One flag hung limp from a wooden pole marked with a crude red emblem. It snapped only when the wind shifted. Near the center, sprawled beside the fire like a king with no court, was Wells Harper. He slept with his boots on, one hand draped lazily over a blanket, the other near the stock of a rifle. His coat lay beneath him, a pillow for someone who believed no vengeance would ever come. Garrett raised his hand. The women scattered like threads pulled loose from the same knot. Hannah circled low, staying close to the rocky edge of the canyon. She carried a small tin canister tucked into her coat. Oil, soap cloth, a fuse. Near a wagon stacked high with hay, she crouched low and slid the canister beneath it, pressing it into the straw with careful, practiced hands.
A flick of her flint, a breath, and the fire caught. Bess climbed higher, scaling a slope of loose shale until she reached a perch with a view of the entire camp. She knelt, braced her arm, and leveled her crossbow, her eyes locked on the man repairing the wheel closest to the fire. Calm. Still. Waiting. Joanne crept in from the opposite side, her path weaving between discarded crates and firewood stacks. Her feet made no sound on the packed earth. Her eyes stayed fixed on Harper. She could see his face clearly now, older than she remembered but still sharp around the mouth. Arrogant, relaxed. Garrett melted into the shadows near the tents, a ghost with a blade in each hand. Then the signal came, a sharp whistle. One note. Fire bloomed beneath the hay, leaping into the morning air like a beast unleashed. Flames roared upward, crackling as they consumed the dry grass. Bess loosed her bolt. The man by the wagon dropped, his hammer still clutched in his hand. Garrett moved fast. One man fell without sound. Another barely had time to gasp before his throat opened. Joanne stepped into the ring of firelight. Harper sat up, disorientated. Smoke stung his eyes. His hand fumbled for the rifle, but it was too late. She stood before him, the axe in both hands, silhouetted by flame. He blinked, recognition settling over him like frost. His lips moved, forming a word, maybe her name, maybe not. She didn't care. The axe fell. Once. Then again. And again. The fire snapped and hissed behind her, but inside the circle of her rage, there was only silence. Blood spread beneath Harper's body, dark and slow, seeping into the ash-streaked earth. When it was over, she dropped the axe and stepped back. Garrett emerged from the shadows. Bess slid down the hill, her boots kicking dust. Hannah joined them last, a cloth pressed to her face, coughing from the smoke.
None of them spoke. There was no triumph, no cheer, only stillness. And the fire, still burning. 2 days later, the women returned to the place they had once stumbled into as castaways. The sawmill stood quiet beneath a soft sky, the trees swaying gently as if exhaling after a long-held breath. The air smelled of earth and smoke and pine, but no longer of fear. The walls had been reinforced with stone and timber scavenged from the canyon. The broken windows were patched with hides and boards. Inside, the space was dry and warm. A hearth burned slow and steady, casting golden light over the floor, now swept clean of splinters and ash. Outside, a wooden sign had been hammered into the earth beside the path. The words carved by hand were uneven but clear. For the forgotten. Bess had taken a piece of charred wood and drawn around it lines of trees aflame, 3 small figures and a larger one in the distance. The story in symbols, etched into grain. Hannah had claimed the far wall of the structure, setting up a table with jars, cloth, and dried herbs. She spent her days tending to injured animals. Birds with broken wings, a fox with a torn leg. Her hands, though still wrapped in bandages, moved with purpose. She spoke to the animals softly, the way she had once spoken to the dying. Garrett never left. He built a small cabin a short walk from the mill, a square structure with a porch and a single shuttered window. Each morning he arrived with water from the spring, sometimes with berries, sometimes with silence. He rarely stayed long, but he returned without fail. The path between the mill and the cabin became worn with use, as if it had always been there. They didn't speak often, words had never been their strength, but understanding passed between them with glances, nods, shared tasks. It was enough. Joanne kept a notebook now. The cover was frayed, the pages yellowed, salvaged from the bottom of an old crate. She didn't write daily, or even regularly, but when she did, the words came to be daily or even regularly, but when she did, the words came fast. They weren't memories, they weren't plans, just facts, moments, proof. The lines read like breath. We made fire. Bess learned to trap. Hannah grew time. Garrett listens more than he speaks. The last page she wrote in that week read, "We are here, still." One evening, the 4 of them sat around the fire outside. The air was cool, the wind soft. Embers drifted into the night like fireflies. Joanne looked into the flames and spoke quietly, without urgency. "If they come back," she said, "we'll be ready." Bess smiled, her hands stained with charcoal. "And if they don't?" Joanne didn't answer right away. She let the quiet settle around them. Then she lifted her gaze to the trees swaying in rhythm above. "Then we're still alive." The wind moved through the forest then. Not loud, just enough to carry away the last ash from the canyon. The trees whispered in its wake, the knot of endings, of continuance, of space made for something new. And the sawmill stood not as a ruin, but as a beginning.